In the multiverse of baseball, there's a reality where one of the biggest trades in Braves history would have been consummated, where Jim Leyland doesn't throw a wrench into the equation and Barry Bonds lands in Atlanta. Welcome into another What If edition of Battery Power. Cory McCartney along with Grant McAuley. And Grant, in the annals of what ifs for this franchise, there are few storylines more enticing than what would have happened if the Braves were able to complete a deal for Barry Bonds in the preseason of 1992.
It would have been an unbelievable move, and who knows what would have happened of the decade to follow. Heck, who knows what would have been happening the following October when the Braves had one of their greatest moments in franchise history against Barry Bonds and the Pittsburgh Pirates. So we've got a lot to untangle here with all of the different connections that this could have were Barry Bonds to have been traded to the Braves. Everything had been signed off. It had become official, and he had joined that club prior to the 1992 season. So keep in mind this time frame. The Braves had just gone worst to first and gone to the 91 World Series. They were just embarking on what would be the 14 straight division titles, 5 trips to the World Series in total by the time the 90s were done. There's a lot that you could really point at this trade and ask yourself that very question, Cory, what if?
So as we like to do in this exercise, before we look at the alternate reality, we have to look at how things actually played out. In early 1992, Terry Pendleton was called into a meeting with John Schuerholz and Bobby Cox at the Braves West Palm facility. They wanted to know if Bonds' ego would be a problem in the Braves clubhouse. And Pendleton told me the message was, you go get him and I'll figure out the rest of it. Tom Glavine also told me he was convinced that this was happening. Everything seemed set. The Braves were going to send a package that had Alejandro Pena, Keith Mitchell, and an undecided prospect to the Pirates for Barry Bonds, who was in the final year of his contract. Schuerholz told me that the players involved all knew they were going, but once Jim Leyland found out, I mean, he was not having it, even if it was the final year of the deal for Bonds. So the trade was over. The two teams, as you mentioned, would meet in the NLCS that year, a series that, of course, ended with one of the franchise's indelible moments in the postseason, the Sid Bream slide to send the Braves back to the World Series. It was all. Think about it though. The reality is obviously fascinating, but what could have happened though if this thing could have played itself out and it would have been Bonds on that Braves team that ended up making a return to the World Series?
It would have been a very, very different Braves team, but not as much in 92, I think, I feel like it would have had a ripple effect throughout the rest of the decade. Because if we look at what the Braves had in place at that point, well, yeah, I mean, you're trading Alejandro Pena, who at that point had spent just a couple of months with your club in 91. We know that Keith Mitchell did not go on to become Kevin Mitchell, despite the fact those bloodlines were there. And I had heard, as a younger Braves fan, and maybe back in those days, and really no reason to parse through it now, that some of the bigger names, if you want to call them that were rumored to be involved in that Bonds trade, Brian Hunter, who was a good-looking rookie first baseman in 91 for the Braves, and Jeff Blauser, who we know spent quite a bit of time as the Braves shortstop. But you never go back and look and think, oh, all these marquee names and big prospects. The Pirates weren't going to get Chipper Jones for Barry Bonds for 1 year of Barry Bonds. But I think 92 would have been a really interesting case study. But Cory, I don't know where exactly we want to start, but I think you have to wonder what happens in the offseason of 1992, because that's where we always seem to tie this thing together. The common thread is, if the Braves go and get Barry Bonds, do they sign Greg Maddux in the winter of 92? And I would contend that that is not necessarily something that has to be mutually exclusive. What do you think?
Yeah, that's obviously, to me, is the biggest domino. They end up getting Maddux that offseason for 5 years and $28 million. But I go back to December of 92, and Bonds obviously ends up signing with the Giants. The Bay Area native, went to high school there. His dad, Bobby, played for the Giants. Of course, Willie Mays is his godfather. I go back to a quote that he said that day when he signed. He said, "It's like a boyhood dream for me. To be able to keep that dream alive is a great honor for me. This is the greatest moment of my life." So there's no certainty. There's no certainty that the Braves could have kept him beyond that one season. If he would have been on a team that made the World Series and you get so close and it plays out the way it actually did and they lose to the Blue Jays, does he feel that onus to want to come back and finish the job? Or do they win in 92 and he says, no, I'm staying around because we got to see if we can do this thing again. But certainly you have to think, one, you can bottle this up and say, what does he look like as part of this in 1992? Or could there have been enough of an appeal to keep him in Atlanta beyond that 1 year and stop him from going and living out that boyhood dream of being a Giant?
Yeah, I think that the draw to San Francisco would eventually take Barry Bonds out there by the time the decade of the 1990s came to a close, even if we suppose, for the purpose of this exercise, that the big money multi-year contract the Braves handed out in 1992, that winter prior to the 93 season, wasn't Maddox, but instead was Barry Bonds. So I started to get down the rabbit hole of what transactionally, if that's the word, would the Barry Bonds trade really mean if he did in fact re-sign during his free agency in the winter of 1992. And some of the questions I found, Corey, were quite fascinating, because if Bonds does come back, the Braves have three very capable slugging outfielders with David Justice and Ron Gant already in place, but they have no true center fielder. Gant could play center. Bonds, I think, could play center at that point in his career if you wanted him to, even if it wasn't necessarily the gold glove kind of component that you got from him if he's a left fielder. But just supposing that the Braves need to deal with that, adding another starting pitcher, if they felt that that was important, maybe you trade David Justice, maybe you trade Ron Gant, because both of those guys were gone by the middle of the decade. In one released, and Gant, who ended up breaking his leg in that motorcycle accident after 93. And of course, David Justice was famously traded to the Cleveland Indians along with Marquise Grissom. Does the Grissom trade happen if you've got Bonds in place? Those are questions I asked myself. And then again, if you get Barry Bonds heading into 1992, does Deion Sanders ever get the chance to have what was at that point his breakout season, to where his baseball career finally started to parallel with his football career in terms of on-field performance? Those are just a handful of the ones I have here on a very long list for what if the Braves got Barry Bonds, then would these things happen?
So if you take Bonds in 1992, that year he was a 9.6 Fangraph Award player, 34 home runs, 100 RBI, a 311, 456, 624 slash line. Obviously won the MVP that year, Gold Glove, Silver Slugger. The Braves production that year in left field was a 259, 319, 420 slash line with 19 homers, 93 RBIs, and a 4.4 Fangraph WAR. So he would have taken them from a position where they were 8th in the league all the way to number 1. And if you take all the combination of what they were all doing offensively, they would have been second only to that A's team that had Canseco and McGuire for second in the league in collective WAR. So, I mean, I think though into October, and Bond to that point, I mean, he was never Mr. October, but he was pretty bad when you think about postseasons to that point in his career. Through the 1992 NLCS, he hit 191 with a 602 OPS, 1 homer, and 83 plate appearances. So I don't know that he maybe would have made that big of a difference in the 92 World Series. I mean, the Braves were getting decent production in left field anyways. You mentioned Deion Sanders. He had over 1,200 OPS in that World Series. I mean, I don't know that Bonds is going to be the deciding factor in that, but certainly during the regular season, he would have elevated a position where they were good but not spectacular.
Yeah. Well, and those numbers you mentioned were primarily Ron Gant, who was having his first down year really since he had come back and become a 30-30 man in 1990 and 1991. Well, he was down to under 20 home runs, still had the 30 steals that year, but he was noticeably down. Otis Nixon came back from a suspension and platooned in center field, left field a little bit as well, along with Deion Sanders, who was having his breakout season, even though he wasn't playing a full 162 because of his football career also taking over the latter portion of the baseball season each year at that time. And then David Justice was occupying right field on a pretty regular basis, give or take an injury here or there that would cause him 15 or 20 games, depending on how long he was on the shelf. But it wasn't really the most productive outfield. And if you look at the highlights of that season, Deion Sanders was pretty high up on that list. I believe he led the National League in triples that year, and he did it in under 100 games, or thereabouts 100 games, which is pretty impressive. But Bonds, I think, would have made a big difference just in the presence that he has. And I do look at, his postseasons weren't very exciting in 1990 and 1991. Obviously, he became a different kind of animal by the time the Giants got to the World Series in 2002. But just looking at it at that point, I still feel like he could have been an impact player and had the opportunity to. But this is another one of those, what if Barry Bonds was in a different environment with a different club? Would his performance have been altogether that different, batting 3rd or 4th for the Atlanta Braves in 1992? I think it's fair to wonder, even though we kind of saw with Pittsburgh, he was not the MVP player in that NLCS yet again, as the Braves did a very nice job both those years in keeping his bat under wraps.
So one thing, I mean, this is obviously not something we can really measure, but certainly, that I go back to that conversation that Sherholtz and Bobby Cox had with Terry Pendleton, asking about the ego and asking how that ego would fit in to that clubhouse. And Sherholtz told me, years ago that, look, if a guy didn't fit into what we wanted to do within the tenor of our clubhouse, they were gone. I mean, we saw, obviously, Deion Sanders did not have a long run in Atlanta. We know that, all that goes in with prime time. I mean, I guess I wonder that, like, could the ego of Bonds really over time have, kept under wraps in the way that Bobby Cox, held things over in that clubhouse? Would he have ultimately meshed with that group of Braves players? I think is another fascinating question.
Yeah, I think perhaps that there's a lot that is made out of that, that there is an effect. And then some of it kind of becomes the stuff of legend where you always think about, well, this guy thinks a lot of himself. Well, there's a good reason he did, because he was probably the best baseball player at the very least in the National League at that time, and possibly all of baseball for the decade of the 1990s. Again, the short list is Bonds and King Griffey Jr., and then you can take the field if you want to get into semantics with other stuff. But one of the other things that I kind of wondered about is if Bonds does re-sign, going beyond the 1992 season, putting aside Deion Sanders, Otis Nixon, the outfield alignment with Gant and Justice, all of that stuff, then looking into 1993. If you've got Bonds back for another year, keep in mind, is there ever that great pennant race between the Braves and the Bonds-led Giants? Clearly not, because he'd be playing in Atlanta. Did the Braves ever trade for Fred McGriff? Or is there a kid named Ryan Klesko who is perhaps taking over as the first baseman of the 90s for the Braves? That's another question, because 1993 would have looked altogether different, because the San Francisco Giants may have been good, but they wouldn't have been as good as they were, 100+ wins, without having Barry Bonds there. So that's another question. Is it addition by subtraction? The Giants don't get Bonds. The Braves have Bonds. What does that pennant race look like? Because it's a big reason why we have the wild card in effect these days, because the Giants won 102 baseball games and got to go sit at home and watch the team that won one more game go on. But every other division winner in the National League, and I believe the American League that year, none of them won as many games as the Giants. So why were they sitting at home? That's a question that's been asked and answered at this point, and that's why we have expanded playoffs, among other things.
Well, we can obviously debate how long Bonds would have actually stayed a Brave, what he could have provided for a team that went to the World Series without him in the lineup. You can't debate, though, that if John Sherholtz had pulled this deal off, I mean, I think when you take deals in hindsight, if he could have gotten Barry Bonds for that package of players, I mean, that would have been one of the finest moments in the career of a guy who ultimately ended up in the Hall of Fame as the Braves general manager.
No doubt about it. I think that Sherholtz has spoken about this many, many times. And of course, the general manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates at that time was Ted Simmons, who has just been inducted into the Hall of Fame, a former Brave himself at the very twilight of his career, but a guy who kind of had to cave in to the pressure of Jim Leland, who said, look, we still got a really good baseball team, but if you take Barry Bonds away, we're not going to be able to overcome already having lost Bobby Bonilla, already having lost 20-game winner in John Smiley, and just trying to cobble things together in 92 and win the NL East again. And of course, we know the deep freeze that the Pirates contention went into after Sid slid in 1992. But as I go back and look at this Bonds trade for what it could have been, I think there are so many ripple effects moving forward into the 90s in whether or not the Braves make a number of other trades, including the one that sent Justice to Cleveland for Kenny Lofton, along with Marquise Grissom. Does Marquise Grissom ever become an Atlanta Brave? What does all of this look like if you get an outfielder like Barry Bonds that would have changed the Braves' plans in the most, I think, earth-shaking and groundbreaking way that you possibly can when you add a franchise player like that, if he did, in fact, stay around beyond just the 1 year of 92. But to bring it full circle, I still feel the pull of San Francisco between his father, Bobby Bonds, and his godfather, Willie Mays, was going to win out. And eventually, Barry was going to have that trip back by the Bay, even if it didn't happen until the late 90s. That just seemed to be the trajectory he was on. I think he chose the right team in 93 when he went out there and signed. And I think the Braves made a pretty darn good choice, and the best choice for them in signing Greg Maddux in the offseason of 1992. So I guess in some ways, with this story, you could say all's well that ends well. Bonds didn't win the World Series with the San Francisco Giants, and that's unfortunate, but the Braves did win a World Series with Greg Maddux, as he helped lead them into a decade in which they were one of the best teams in all of baseball year in and year out.
Yeah, as much fun as it is to go down this rabbit hole, I agree with you. I think it's one and done. I think he winds up in San Francisco in a hurry, and I think you get that small package in return, if you're the Pirates and you watch them go, and we all watch them wind up in San Francisco a year later. But there are going to be plenty more of these what ifs as we continue here. And if there's any of them that you want to see, put it in the comments section here on YouTube, and make sure you reach out to Grant or myself on Twitter. Let us know what you're thinking. We'd love to know what storylines you would like us to see play out here on Battery Power. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the Talking Chop YouTube channel. That means like, subscribe, turn on notifications so you get an alert every single time that we drop a new episode. I'm Cory McCartney. He's Grant McAuley. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time, Braves Country.